The room was filled with soft lamplight, muffled by the sound of conversation and laughter. People were chatting in groups around a table with drinks, in comfortable chairs, and just standing by the walls. I first saw him when he entered, confidently surveying the guests. His blonde hair was impeccably styled, and his eyes drew me in like a warm summer sky. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt something that was hard to describe in words. His figure disappeared into the crowd, but the impression remained. I continued to talk to my acquaintances, although my thoughts returned to this stranger. Suddenly, I noticed him again. He was standing at the table with drinks, and the gaze of his bright eyes found me again among dozens of faces. It was a strange feeling, as if we already knew each other, but I could not understand from where. As the evening progressed, I decided to take a little walk around the room. At some point, we were side by side. His figure was much closer, and I noticed a slight smile on his face. Something about his expression seemed familiar to me. Maybe it was the way he held himself, or that open but calm gaze. I stopped at the drinks table, choosing a glass. Time seemed to slow down as I felt him approach. His figure cast a faint shadow on the table, and I could feel his presence without even looking back. He took the glass, and I felt strangely calm next to him. Our hands almost touched as I reached for my own. When I stepped aside a little to find a quieter place, he followed me. We found ourselves at the panoramic window, which opened to a view of the night city. The moonlight emphasized his features, and a surprise and a strange sense of harmony struggled within me. His light eyes seemed even brighter in contrast to the soft darkness around. His gaze lingered on me, longer than I expected. There were no words between us, but the silence was comfortable. Fragments of thoughts arose in my head. Why him? Something in his posture and movements betrayed confidence, but it was not cold self-confidence, but some inner strength that inspired trust. When we were alone at the window, he suddenly smiled, barely perceptible. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I'm glad we're here." Something about that gesture made me feel warm. Even if it was a coincidence, I felt like I would never forget that moment. There was still laughter and conversation around us, but it seemed distant and muffled. His bright eyes were focused on the horizon outside the window, but I knew he could feel my presence next to him. I stood still, drawn into this strange silence that was just between the two of us, despite the noise of the party. Almost imperceptibly, he moved a little closer, leaving very little space between us. His posture was relaxed, but something in his gestures betrayed caution. I didn't move, allowing this closeness to exist. It was like a balance between unfamiliarity and something strangely familiar. I saw his hand move slightly. For a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to touch mine, but he stopped, as if hesitating. It was such a small movement, but there was more emotion in it than in many of the words I had heard that evening. My heart beat faster, and I knew that this moment would stay with me. A wave of laughter suddenly filled the room, and I couldn't help but smile. He smiled back, and it seemed to lighten the atmosphere between us. In that moment, we both realized that there was nothing stopping us from being here on this evening and just enjoying the moment. Time flew by. I thought I had completely forgotten about my watch until I noticed him looking at his. His slight movement caught my attention again, and I felt the evening steadily drawing to a close. I felt the evening gradually fade, but our conversation, even without words, was so rich. Michael stood nearby, and his presence brought an unexpected sense of peace, although we were almost strangers. I noticed how the soft light of the lamps reflected in his light eyes, making them so transparent that it seemed as if you could look into them and see something more. Outside the window, the lights of the city flickered, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that seemed to freeze around us. At that moment, it seemed to me that we were left alone, even among the crowd. He came a little closer again, and I involuntarily stopped my gaze on his hand, which barely noticeably touched the edge of the table next to me. My breath caught, and I felt our silence say more than words could. I caught his eye and for a moment thought this would be the last scene of the evening, but he wasn't in a hurry to leave. We moved to another corner of the room, where it was a little quieter, and the noise of the party now seemed distant. He turned to me, tilted his head cautiously, as if he wanted to say something, but changed his mind. I felt the air between us thicken, as if time had decided to slow down even more. His hand was next to mine on the arm of the couch, and I held my breath again. There were so many questions in my mind, but I didn't dare voice them. Instead, we just looked at each other, and I knew that this moment was more important than any words. The evening went on, but time with him had a different rhythm. I realized that everything around me had lost its meaning. Only those looks, that closeness that needed no explanation. He took his glass from the table and smiled a little, creating a strange feeling of lightness that relieved everything that was hanging in the air. I returned his smile, so sincere that I surprised myself. I wanted this moment to last longer, but at the same time, I felt that I was already waiting for something to continue. Something more. Something that could happen tomorrow or another day. It seemed to me that he felt the same, because there was a promise in his gaze, albeit an unspoken one. As the party began to die down, we found ourselves on the terrace. The air was cool, and I involuntarily hugged myself, trying to warm myself. Without a word, he took off his jacket and carefully draped it over my shoulders. There was something special about this simple action, something that made me forget all my doubts and hesitations. I raised my head to thank him, but I saw something more in his eyes, a warmth and understanding that I hadn't seen in a long time. The silence between us was so natural that even the noise of the city behind us seemed out of place. In that moment, I realized that this evening would change more than I thought. And although words were superfluous, our looks said it all. His hand lightly touched my shoulder, as if confirming this feeling, and I felt something change in my heart. We left the party together, as if it were the most natural decision. In the silence of the night city, only our footsteps echoed on the deserted streets. The lanterns cast a warm light on the cobblestones, creating long shadows that intertwined on the ground. I felt his presence next to me, and it was strangely calming. He suggested we take a walk, and I nodded silently, feeling how the evening, which was already coming to an end, was turning into something more. We walked slowly, without hurrying, and I found myself breathing freely for the first time in a long time. He didn't try to fill the silence with words, but in his steps, in his soft smile, there was what I needed at that moment. The walk ended at a small cafe that was already opening for the first customers. He looked at me questioningly, and I smiled slightly in return. We went inside, and the warm aroma of coffee filled the space around us. The cafe was almost empty. Only a few tables stood under dim lights. He ordered 2 coffees, and we sat by the window, beyond which dawn was beginning. The morning light flooded the street, and it was so quiet and cozy that it seemed to me that the world had stopped just for us. I watched as he, with his head down, stirred his coffee with a spoon, and there was something so homely in this simple gesture, as if we had known each other all our lives. The dawn light was penetrating the cafe more and more, forcing the shadows to give way to bright rays. As I watched the steam rising from my cup of coffee, I suddenly realized how easy our silence had become. And then, unexpectedly for myself, I laughed, remembering how ridiculous it all looked from the outside. The two of us just getting to know each other, sitting in an almost empty cafe at dawn, as if this were the most ordinary start to the day. He looked up, surprised by my laughter, but then, understanding the reason, he joined me. His laughter was so sincere, so warm, that I felt this moment being etched in my memory forever. The warmth of our smiles seemed to dissolve all possible awkwardness, leaving only ease and a desire to continue this conversation, even without words. When we left the cafe, the world was already waking up. The city was coming to life. The streets were filling with the first passers-by, and I still felt the comfort of the calm atmosphere we had left behind at the table. He walked next to me, and I felt the cool morning wind slightly unfurling my hair. We stopped in one of the small squares, and he turned to me. There was a mystery in his eyes, but I also noticed warmth and caution, as if he was weighing his every move. He said nothing, only tilted his head slightly, as if asking, "Will we meet again?" I couldn't help but smile slightly and nodded in response, knowing that this conversation was unnecessary. When I got home, I felt the fatigue of the party mixed with the excitement of the morning. Taking off my shoes, I sat by the window and thought about how this ordinary evening had turned into something so special. Now I couldn't stop thinking about his smile, how easy it was to be silent with him, and his bright eyes, in which the light of the morning sun reflected. When I opened my phone, I saw that there was a message waiting for me. My heart trembled. It was from him. It only had a few words, but they were enough for me to understand that this was only the beginning of our story. The next day passed in a strange atmosphere of expectation. Despite the usual activities, I still had that warm peace from yesterday morning. Even ordinary things, the turning of the pages of a book or the noise of the coffee maker in the kitchen, seemed filled with new meaning. His message was simple, but I couldn't stop thinking about every word. In the evening, when the city had already settled into its usual rhythms, I found myself on the street where he had invited me. It was a quiet place, but there was a slight tension in the air, as if the very air knew that this evening was important. I saw him from afar. He stood leaning against the railing of an ancient bridge, looking into the distance, as if searching the stars for an answer to his thoughts. I came closer, and his eyes met mine, warm but a little mysterious. We stood side by side, looking at the quiet water below us. The stars reflected in the river seemed alive. His presence next to me was calm and confident. I felt that this silence was not about awkwardness, but that words were now superfluous. We started moving along the river. I was walking a little ahead when I suddenly felt his hand gently touch mine. I turned around, and our eyes met. This moment was so quiet and simple, but at the same time, there was a power in it that is difficult to describe. I did not withdraw my hand, and he squeezed my palm tighter, as if to say, "I am here, I am near." At this moment, there were no barriers between us, just two people who no longer hide their feelings. When I returned home, only one thing was ringing in my head: how every gesture, every look of his had filled the evening with something special. I sat in the semi-dark room, looking at the stars outside the window, and again I returned to the moment when our hands met. The slight warmth of his touch seemed endless, as did that look that promised more than words. I realized that this evening would stay with me for a long time, like one of those stories that become a part of you. I woke up to the sound of a text message. Sleepy, I reached for my phone. His name was flashing on the screen. The message was simple. "How was your morning?" I smiled, feeling my heart clench at that small gesture. The sleep immediately disappeared, leaving only warmth. I leaned back against the pillow and thought about how to respond without looking too interested, even though it was already obvious in my heart. His message set the tone for the whole day. I couldn't focus on my usual tasks. Every little thing reminded me of our meeting. The sun seemed brighter, and the usual routes seemed more meaningful. I checked my phone often, even though there were no new messages. I kept waiting, even though I didn't want to admit it even to myself. We agreed to meet in the evening. When I got to the place, he was already waiting. He was standing under a tree, in the shade, looking at something on his phone. When he saw me, he raised his head and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made you forget everything else. He looked a little tired, but happy. I walked closer, and our walk began. Our walk didn't last long. Suddenly it started to rain. Drops fell to the ground, mixing the smell of freshness and spring. He quickly opened his umbrella, but half of me was already wet. I laughed, and he smiled guiltily. Under one umbrella, we had to walk very close, and I felt his warmth next to me. The rain forced us to turn onto a quiet street, where we found ourselves alone among the whisper of raindrops. The rain forced us to stop under the canopy of a small cafe. We stood side by side in silence, watching the drops run down the glass roof. I felt the beauty of this moment envelop me in a wave of warmth. He said nothing unnecessary, just occasionally glanced in my direction. This silence had more meaning than many words. and I felt that this evening would remain in my memory forever. When the rain had almost stopped, we decided to continue walking. He insisted on walking me home. The city looked different after the rain. The air was fresh. The streets seemed renewed. We walked leisurely, talking about familiar things, but I knew that deeper thoughts were hidden behind these words. Time seemed to have stopped, and I wanted this road to go on forever. We reached my house, but I didn't want this evening to end. He stopped at the door, umbrella in hand. His gaze was warm and a little uncertain, as if he were daring to say something important. I stood, my hand touching the railing, feeling my heart beat a little faster. At that moment, something indescribable reigned between us, as if the air had become denser. Before leaving, he suddenly said that this evening had become special for him. I nodded, but a storm was raging in my soul. I knew that this would not be our last meeting, but I did not want to say goodbye, even for one night. His phrase, "See you tomorrow," sounded like a promise that made me smile. In the morning, I woke up with a smile, despite my tiredness. My thoughts were with him again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something important. My room was quiet. Fresh air was coming in through the window, and I felt like even the little things were starting to matter. I barely noticed my heart beating faster as I checked my phone. He showed up at my office unannounced, and my heart felt a little heavier with surprise. His smile was so familiar and yet so new. I quickly composed myself, trying not to look too surprised. He was talking about his weekend plans, but I could barely hear his words. My heart was racing, and I was trying not to let the emotions boiling inside me show. A few days later, we met again, this time for lunch in a small cafe. He was calm, but I could see the same curiosity in his eyes as before. We laughed, shared stories from work, although in reality, both of us were trying to hide our true thoughts. I felt our eyes meeting more often, and it gave me this strange feeling. I knew there was nothing supposed to be between us, but it was all becoming more important than I expected. Over the next few weeks, we met more and more often at work or in the city, each time by chance, but no longer by chance. He became more and more a part of my world, and I became his part of mine. Our conversations became deeper, without unnecessary words, only looks and moments of silence that spoke more than words. I felt how quickly everything around me was changing, and I could no longer go back to what it was before him. This time we went for a walk after work. We were silent, but it wasn't awkward. The silence between us was like our best conversation ever. He held my hand, and I could feel his warmth even through the thick fabric of his sleeve. We walked in the middle of the park, looking at the trees that still had autumn leaves on them. It was the same autumn, but I felt that everything was changing for the better. This walk remained in my memory as a moment when time seemed to stand still. We sat on a bench, my gaze never leaving his face. He spoke quietly about everything and nothing at the same time, but I heard something more in his words. Every movement, every look, it was like a promise that these moments would stay with me forever. I felt how tightly he held my hand, and my heart trembled with the realization that we were on the verge of something important. We went to the roof of one of his friends to look at the city. The fogs were starting to lift in the morning, and the light from the lamps around seemed soft, creating a magical atmosphere. We sat on the edge of the roof, feeling the wind playing with our hair. His gaze was serious, but I saw a softness in it that was hard to explain. Maybe we both felt that something was changing, and it wasn't scary, but on the contrary, it was comfortable. That evening, on the roof, we were more silent than ever. His eyes were focused, and although he said nothing, I felt that he was waiting for my reaction. My soul was filled with feelings, but I could not find the words. We looked at the night city, and it was important. Not how much we talked, but how close we were. And although his gaze seemed so distant, I felt that we were one. The next morning, everything was as usual, but I felt that I had changed. We met again at work, and I noticed that he looked at me differently. Maybe I had changed too, but I still couldn't figure out if it was for the better. There was still uncertainty in my soul, but I knew one thing. This time, we couldn't just walk past each other. During our lunch break, we left the office to talk. Now there were only looks between us, because everything we wanted to say had already been said without words. We sat on a park bench, and the silence between us seemed to be the best answer to all questions. His gaze was calm but deep, and I felt that we understood each other without the need to explain ourselves. It was more than just an acquaintance, it was a real feeling. A few days later, we met again, but this time at his apartment. He invited me to dinner, and I, not expecting it to turn out this way, agreed. He looked serious as he handed me a glass of wine, and I felt my heart beat faster. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm, but I felt that every word he said had meaning. He said, "We can be more than just acquaintances." His words dispelled all my insecurities, and I saw that we were moving in the same direction. The night that followed that night was special. When I woke up in the morning, his hand was still on mine, and I didn't want to let go. We didn't say much, but there was no need. We were just there, and that was enough. He didn't rush, and neither did I. I felt like with every move he made, I was getting closer to opening up another part of myself to him, and it was an amazing feeling. We woke up together again, and I felt how natural this moment seemed. He stood by the stove, making breakfast, and I sat at the table, watching. I couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. His movements were so confident, and even in such small things as breakfast, I noticed something very important to me. I knew we were just getting started, but this was already more than just a casual acquaintance. This time, we stayed home, not going anywhere. He put on a movie, and we just sat together on the couch, immersed in the darkness of the room. Only the soft light of the screen filled the space, and I felt his presence changing my perception of the world around me. Every look he gave, every movement brought us closer to something greater. The whole evening was calm and so right, even when we were silent. That morning was a turning point. We stood on the threshold, and I knew we needed to talk. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same thing I saw in mine. It wasn't just a conversation, it was an understanding. We both wanted more than what we had up until that moment, and I realized that this was the moment to accept our feelings. Every day felt different now. I couldn't pretend that everything was going the same anymore. This wasn't just a dating story anymore, it was something real. He wasn't just someone from work or a friend from a party anymore. He had become a part of my life, and I couldn't imagine what it would be like without him. We went out of town for the weekend. The weather was perfect, and I felt like I was enjoying every minute of it. We walked through the woods, talking about everything and nothing. His voice was soft and calm, and I just listened, enjoying the silence around us. It was one of those moments where everything feels right, like this day was made just for the two of us. I stopped thinking about the future. I just was in the moment, with him. This day was remembered for one unexpected moment. Evening had fallen, and we were sitting on the shore of the lake when he gently took my hand. I watched his face as he came closer to me and kissed me. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a moment when everything I had thought about before simply disappeared. I forgot about everything except him. It was like a small miracle that suddenly became reality. Despite the wonderful times we had together, I started to feel a little doubtful. This was a new phase in our lives, and I couldn't help but ask myself if I was ready for it. Were we really at a place where we could continue together? The more I thought about it, the more difficult each conversation became. I didn't know if it was just fear of change or something else. One evening, when the silence between us was becoming more and more noticeable, I decided to speak up. I said that I had many doubts, that I didn't understand where we were going. He listened to me carefully, without interrupting, but I could see that he had his own thoughts. He said that he was ready to work on anything, but we had to find the answers together. It wasn't just a conversation about the future, it was the moment when we really started to open up to each other. We worked through our doubts together, and every day I felt our connection grow stronger. I began to understand that it wasn't about being perfect, it was about trusting each other. All the worries and anxieties I had before began to fade away, and I was finally able to believe that our relationship could be something great. It might not always be easy, but it was worth it. A few days after our conversation, everything changed. He left for work, and I was left alone, waiting for him to return. This temporary distance made me feel something more than I expected. I realized that, despite all my doubts, he had become a part of my life, and every minute without him seemed incredibly empty. I felt that I could not simply forget what we had created together. When he left, I started remembering all our first moments together. How we met at a party, how we were so different, yet so complementary. I often remembered his laugh, his soft way of speaking. Every moment was so vivid. But now, everything was locked in memory. And with each new memory, I felt how much I wanted that time to come back. When he came back, I felt something had changed. We were no longer just two people hanging out together. We had become something more. He looked at me with a new depth in his eyes, and I was no longer afraid of what could separate us. I realized that we were not just together because of circumstances, but because we wanted to be together. He was the person I was ready to build a future with, even though I didn't yet know what it would be. We spent that evening together, just sitting by the fireplace and talking. He told me about his experiences during his absence, and I opened up to him about mine. It was that solitude that changed our relationship. We began to understand each other on a level we could not even imagine before. It was not just an evening, it was a real rebirth of our connection. A few days after our return, we went for a walk in the park. There was almost no wind, and everything around us became extremely quiet. We were walking side by side, and he suddenly took my hand without saying a word. It was a moment that spoke for itself. We didn't need words. Everything was said with a look and a gesture. I was overwhelmed by the feeling that everything I wanted was already here. Now that we had been through everything together, I felt like I had no more doubts. The future remained open, but I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't know what awaited us, but with him, I was ready to go through any difficulties. We would build our future together, no matter what it was. Unexpectedly for myself, I discovered that these months together had become more than just time together. I began to understand that my feelings for him were not just emotional infatuation. They were something deeper. This feeling was not the same as in the first days, when everything was new and exciting. Now it was a real attachment, a feeling that I could not live without him. I could not express it yet, but his presence had become a necessary part of my life. He noticed the changes in my behavior. It was no longer the lighthearted mood that we had at the beginning. Now we talked more seriously, and there were more pauses between us than before. However, it was in these moments that I felt how important it was for him to understand what was going on in my soul. One evening, when we were sitting in the kitchen and just silent, he asked me what was wrong with me. I looked at him and realized that it was time to open up to him about my feelings. My response was quiet but sincere. I said I now understood why he had become so important to me. It wasn't an easy confession to make, but I knew I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. He smiled, and I could see how relieved he was. Those moments were like a recognition for both of us that we had truly found each other. He said he felt the same way, but he remembered how long we had both doubted each other. Now everything became clearer. We no longer had doubts. No longer were we afraid to be vulnerable. With each new day, we became closer. I felt that this invisible connection between us had grown stronger, and, although we had not yet planned the future, I was ready to go through it with him. Sometimes, in the silence, we didn't even need words, because a look or a gesture could say more. In the days that followed, I felt our closeness grow even stronger. I realized that I had opened up to him more than to anyone else. And although we didn't discuss it openly, I felt that we were both ready to go through all the difficulties together. I felt that with him I could be myself, without hiding my weaknesses and doubts. And it was more than just a relationship. It was real closeness. And yet, I couldn't forget some moments that left a mark on my heart. Sometimes I would relive memories of the past that became difficult when we went through difficult times. He noticed this, but he never pressured me. He understood that I had the right to have doubts and insecurities, and he didn't try to change that. His support was what helped me move forward. With each week, we found a new rhythm. We began to plan our future, not concretely, but to dream about what could be. I learned to appreciate the little moments, simple conversations, walks, and even silence. And he taught me that the more time we spent together, the more I realized that this moment was not to be missed. This was our now, and we were ready to enjoy it. We became more open to each other. As we discussed our plans, we felt like we were part of the same world. We hadn't considered the future together before, but now it had become an integral part of our lives. I really started thinking about how we could connect our paths, without fear and without doubt. At that moment, I realized that we didn't need a clear plan. It was enough to just be together and trust in what would happen. One evening, after a long walk, we were sitting on a park bench, and he suddenly confessed that he had always felt a special affection for me. It was so unexpected and touching that I was left speechless. His words touched me deeply, and I realized that he, like me, had experienced this period of doubt. His look was sincere, and I felt that it was not just a word, but a real confession of feelings. Although we felt a connection, there were still many unknowns. I felt my emotions mixed with anxiety. There was no clear guarantee that everything would be okay, and sometimes I was afraid to take a step back, not knowing what lay ahead. He noticed my questionable behavior, but this time he didn't ask. He simply took my hand and quietly told me that everything would be okay. His calmness helped me find inner balance, but the fear remained. Despite the uncertainty, we found each other again. We both understood that the future would never be clear, but what was more important was that we were still together. Every time we spent time together, every moment became important. We no longer asked the question, "What will happen?" We simply enjoyed this moment, knowing that right now was the best. One evening, as we sat together in a cozy coffee shop, I felt how powerful silence can be. We didn't need to say much to convey what was going on inside us. This was what we had gained after all the hardships, the opportunity to just be together, without words, just in silence. I felt like this was just the beginning of something new. I didn't know what was in store for us, but now I was ready to walk this path with him. I realized that we were both changing, growing, and that was good. And every day was an opportunity for new feelings, new emotions, and new experiences. Not everything was perfect. Sometimes we faced obstacles, doubts that our feelings could survive all the trials. But what we experienced together was more than just shared moments. It was something deeper, something that gave us the strength to move forward, despite any difficulties. We accepted each other without trying to change, without trying to fit into something perfect, and that became the foundation on which we built our relationship. Every day I felt my feelings for him grow deeper, and I myself became more open and authentic. That night, I lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened. I remembered our first meetings, our first moments together, which seemed so unusual, but at the same time important. I was overcome by the feeling that we had gone through all this together was not by chance. Every step we took, every moment we had had was important. All those moments of doubt and fear had made us stronger. And so, I lay there, in the darkness, and I felt that now we were invincible. He was there, and I was no longer afraid of the future. I knew that if we were together, everything would be okay. The next day, we came to a decision. We had to talk about our future plans. I was afraid to openly discuss it because I knew it could change our relationship, but at the same time, I couldn't continue to live in uncertainty. Every moment spent together seemed so important that I didn't want to miss a chance. And so, we sat in a coffee shop. I looked him in the eye and asked what we wanted from this. His gaze was calm, and he just smiled. He said he didn't know for sure, but he wanted to walk this path with me, and that was all I needed to hear. Just a few days after our important conversation, he was going on a business trip for a few weeks. I knew it would be hard. It seemed like even a few days without him could change everything. As soon as we said goodbye, I felt a surge of anxiety. Would we be able to endure this distance? Would our feelings be strong enough to remain unshakable? I saw the same thing in his eyes. We were both silent, but everything was said without words. He kissed my forehead and left, and I stood there, waiting for the moment when I would see him again. The first few days without him were hard. I felt like a part of me was missing. I couldn't focus on work or everyday tasks because my thoughts kept returning to him. I wrote to him on Messenger every evening, but it was no substitute for real contact. The distance became more and more tangible, and I began to doubt my abilities. But then I remembered what we had talked about, and my soul felt a little lighter. He was there, even if he wasn't physically here. When he returned, I couldn't hide my joy. His gaze on me was the same, but I felt that everything had changed between us. The distance had not broken our bond, but, on the contrary, had made it stronger. And when I saw his smile, I realized that all my doubts were in vain. We hugged, and that was enough to make all the worries disappear. I felt that, despite the time and distance, we were truly meant for each other. We both felt like we had come home after a long journey. As soon as he crossed the threshold of my apartment, I felt the warmth of his presence that I had missed so much. His gaze was calm, but I could feel that he was also worried about the time we were not together. He sat down on the sofa, and I sat next to him. The night was quiet. Only a light wind whispered outside the window. I looked at him, and it seemed to me that this was the same moment when I first saw him. Everything was new, but still familiar. A few days after he returned, we made an important decision to go away together for a few days to a small town. All these months, we had just been watching each other from a distance, not giving ourselves the chance to fully open up. And now we decided that it was time to be together, without a doubt. I could feel my heart beating faster, because we were choosing the same path, and it was wonderful. He smiled as we discussed our plans, and I knew that this was the right step for us. When we arrived in the town, I was struck by how cozy and calm it was. The streets were almost empty, the air was fresh, and there was a silence around that you could only listen to. We walked together, holding hands, and it was very special. I couldn't believe that we had finally found the time to spend this moment together, without the hustle and bustle. I looked at him, and he was smiling, and I understood that all those worries and doubts were in vain. We chose each other, and that was enough. I don't remember how much time we spent just walking around aimlessly, stopping at shops, cafes, or just sitting on a park bench. At that moment, I felt like we had finally found the harmony I had only dreamed of before. There were no questions or doubts, just us, this moment, and our desire to be together. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. He sat next to me, his presence soothing, and I realized that this was what I had been waiting for so long. These few days were a real test for our relationship. We started to open up to each other more than before. I felt my walls dissolve when he shared his experiences and dreams. He was open too, and it allowed me to understand how much we could share together. We were no longer afraid of our feelings, because we knew we could support each other no matter what. The morning after our first night together in this small town was incredibly peaceful. I woke up to the sun barely touching the edges of the curtains, scattering a soft light across the room. He was sleeping next to me, his breathing calm and even. I looked at him, feeling my heart grow quiet with tenderness. All those months of being apart seemed so far away now. I realized that in this moment, next to him, I felt at home. We left the hotel early in the morning, when the town was just waking up. It was our first walk together of the new day, and we could feel the fresh air entering our lungs. I held his hand, and we walked side by side in silence. I didn't feel any pressure or hurry, only silence and harmony. We weren't in a hurry, we just walked. And that was the best thing. We continued walking, and at some point he stopped. He looked kind of thoughtful. I noticed that a shadow had appeared in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He began to talk about his past, about what kept him from communicating with people, about his fears and doubts. I listened to him silently, feeling how these discoveries became part of my reality. I didn't judge him, but only felt deep sympathy. After that conversation, we felt the distance between us shrink. There were no more fears or doubts, and we became truly close. I realized that his discoveries allowed me to get to know him even more deeply, and this, in turn, became the key to our true closeness. We were no longer just two people spending time together, but two people who were ready to support each other at any moment. We spent those few days together, and I felt my perspective on life change. I stopped looking at the future as something uncertain and scary. Now I saw a common path ahead of me, a path that we would walk together. With him, I no longer feared the unknown, because I knew that we could handle anything if we were together. Despite all these changes and discoveries, we returned home to our familiar surroundings. The town was left behind, and we found ourselves back in our familiar realities. But now we were different. We had been through trials, and it had changed our relationship. I was no longer afraid that anything could change our closeness. He was here, close, and that was all I needed to know. A few days later, when everything was back to normal, we decided to cook dinner together. I stood in the kitchen, trying to remember all the recipes I had learned, and he helped me, trying to cook something simple. There was a special look in his eyes, as if we were not just cooking food, but creating a moment together that would become part of our story. He laughed when I accidentally knocked something over on the stove, and that laughter made everything even warmer. Dinner was simple, but we enjoyed every moment. After we ate, I sat on the couch, comfortably nestled next to him. He held my hand, and we stared silently at the fire, which was barely crackling in the fireplace. It was all so familiar and so new at the same time. I felt like this was our home, our place where we could be ourselves, without any unnecessary words. The next day, when we returned to our usual everyday lives, new difficulties appeared. Work, responsibilities, problems that we could not ignore. But now I was not alone. We solved everything together, supporting each other. And even if it was difficult, I felt that together we could cope with anything. We were no longer just two people who met by chance. We became a team. Over time, when we started spending more time together, the first serious disagreements emerged. It happened because of a small thing, a misunderstanding in a conversation, which grew into a big conflict. I couldn't understand why he was reacting the way he did, and he couldn't understand me. It became a lesson for both of us. We started listening to each other more, looking for compromises, instead of keeping our feelings to ourselves. Despite this conflict, we realized that it's not about avoiding arguments, but how we resolve them that's important. We sat down, talked, and found a compromise. I realized that sometimes you need to listen not only to the words, but also to what's hidden between them. And this opened up a new level of understanding for us. We became even closer, and this conflict strengthened our bond. After that conflict, our communication became even more open. We were no longer afraid to express our opinions, even if it meant contradicting each other. Openness and honesty became the foundation of our connection. I began to feel like we were creating something real and strong, and it was wonderful. It was a new stage in our relationship. Sometimes we just spent time together, enjoying each other's company. One of those nights we went to a local restaurant. He chose a seat overlooking the city, and I felt special. The dinner wasn't as important as the fact that we were having this moment together. The looks, the words, the gestures, it all created the atmosphere we needed. Every day I felt our relationship grow stronger. We solved problems together, laughed, even cried, but each time we became stronger. And now I knew, this path, even if it will be difficult, we are walking it together. And that was all I needed. The next morning, after we had gone through another difficult situation, I woke up early. Michael was still asleep, his body relaxed, and his face still showing the strain of the previous night. I quietly got out of bed, not wanting to wake him, and went to the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the light that filtered into the room gave everything around a soft and peaceful hue. I breathed in the air, and it became clear to me that even after all the difficulties, we had been able to overcome everything together. After I saw his calmness, I realized that he was having a hard time dealing with some emotions, so I decided not to pressure him. I brought him a cup of coffee, put it on the table next to him, and just sat next to him. We didn't talk much, but at that moment, it wasn't necessary. I felt like we were supporting each other, and that silence was the best conversation between us. Later, we went for a walk in the park. I held his hand, and it was the best feeling in the world. The trees around us were starting to turn golden, and the air was fresh and clean. We took every step together, as if we were finding balance in this world, where there was always room for both of us. I felt that no matter what we had been through, together we could get through anything. During the walk, we sat down on a bench, and Michael began to talk about what had been bothering him lately. It was the first time he had spoken so openly about his experiences. I listened carefully, feeling how each of his words struck me deeper. He no longer hid his feelings, and this brought us even closer. I answered him with what I felt, and this helped him understand that I would always be there. After our frank conversation, we felt that more trust had developed between us. The next day, we decided to cook dinner together. It wasn't just the process of cooking, but a moment when we felt like a team, even in the smallest things. I laughed when he tried to pour the sauce without spilling it, and he laughed back at me. The day was easy and carefree, and I was grateful for every moment we spent together. Sometimes new challenges arose, and I began to feel how important it was to understand each other without unnecessary words. It was in special moments when we both had to take responsibility for what was happening in our lives. However, regardless of these challenges, we always tried not to forget about ourselves and that we were together. Every day with him was a new discovery. Every moment was important to our connection. I began to understand that it was not only about love, but also about the willingness to stand by each other, even when life presented us with new challenges. And even when we couldn't answer all the questions, we were still ready to walk together into the future. A few days later, we were sitting in a cafe where we had first met. I tried to talk about my past, but the words were difficult. Michael seemed to understand that I was not ready to open up completely. He didn't pressure me. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just remained silent, listening carefully to my every word. All my thoughts intertwined, and I felt how important it was to find the strength to share what was difficult to leave in the past. One morning, we set off on a trip out of town. Michael packed our bags and we got in the car, not knowing where we were going, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that we were together. The open fields, the forest roads, the small villages, all of this was a new experience for us. The simple moments of being alone filled our minds. I began to feel that this simplicity was the best thing that could happen between us. In the middle of the journey, when we stopped at a small lake, I realized that this was one of those moments when life does not need a lot of fuss. Just us, nature, and silence. I looked at Michael and realized that with him, I was ready to go through anything. No matter how difficult it was, no matter how many more difficulties we would encounter on the way. It was the realization that we were a whole world to each other. After we got back from the trip, we started talking more about what was ahead of us. Michael said that we were always building our future together, and this was a new step in our relationship. I still felt indecision limiting my answers, but Michael was patient. He took his time, and it gave me the opportunity to open up gradually, step by step. These few months changed us, made us more confident in ourselves and in each other. We began to understand that it doesn't matter what lies ahead. What matters is that we are together. We didn't have any specific plans, and that suited both of us. We were just ready for the new stages that awaited us. The evening when we went for a walk through the city became special. Every step on the night streets was new for us. I told him about my feelings, and he listened, giving me a shoulder to lean on when I needed it. The city streets were filled with people, but at that moment, we remained in our own little world, where everything was important only to us. In the weeks that followed, we began to plan our dreams and what we would do next. And although we didn't yet have all the answers to the questions that worried us, we were sure that we could cope. The most important thing was that we were together, and this gave us the strength to move forward. At times, we began to feel a slight disconnect. It wasn't obvious, but I could see that some things were becoming less clear. Michael became more withdrawn, as if something was weighing on his mind, and I was trying to figure out if there was something about this that we couldn't overcome together. I didn't know how to feel about it, but it made me anxious, and I couldn't hide it. And although we didn't talk about it, I could feel that there was a distance between us, not physical, but emotional. We still spent time together, but shadows of doubt would occasionally come over us, and I began to doubt whether we would be able to overcome these new challenges. One evening, after a difficult conversation, we were left alone, looking at each other but silent. It was unlike us. We always had something to say, even when we disagreed. But today, as if sensing that our views had diverged, we were silent. I tried to understand why, but it was difficult. Michael did not try to reassure me or justify me. His gaze was as always serious, but now there was no lightness in it that I was used to seeing. I could not look away from what I saw in his eyes, but I could not give myself an answer as to why this had happened. The next day, we decided to talk. Maybe not about everything, but it was important. I told him how I felt, and even though my voice was shaking, Michael listened without interrupting. It was a moment when we reconnected, a connection that had been lost in the shadow of uncertainty. We didn't look for blame, we didn't accuse each other. It was our way of getting back to what we had, opening up to each other, not being afraid to show our weakness. Little by little, we regained what made our relationship real. And although the conversation was difficult, at the end, we felt relieved, like we had finally overcome another obstacle in our path. After that conversation, we began to notice how many small moments were returning to our lives again. Michael started laughing again, and I felt how important it was to maintain this feeling of lightness. We walked in the park, talking about small things that once seemed important. These moments again became a reminder for us that our happiness is made up of small and important things. We began to regain a sense of joy from simple moments, and this became very important to us. A few weeks later, we were faced with a big choice. Not one, but many small decisions that were becoming increasingly important to both of us. They weren't big steps, but they changed us and our relationship. We started talking about our plans, although I felt it wasn't time for final decisions yet. Michael calmly asked questions, and I answered with equally careful words, realizing that we still had a long way to go before everything became clear. The day after our reflection, I felt that this stage was just the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. We didn't know what was ahead, but it didn't scare us anymore. Now we could look to the future without being afraid of what was waiting for us on the way. We began to build new dreams, together forming a new reality in which there was no place for fear or doubt. And it was the best moment for both of us, when we knew that we were going in the right direction.